Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fisherman's Post Saltwater Podcast Series. This episode is titled Artificials for Carolina Beach and Wrightsville Beach Speckled Trout. I'm going to be talking with Captain Luke Moser of Coastline Charters, operating out of the Wrightsville and Carolina Beach areas. We're going to be covering such areas as habitat. We're going to be talking about conditions, as in weather and tide. We're going to be talking about tackle and techniques. My name is Gary Hurley of Fisherman's Post. Fisherman's Post has been serving the saltwater fishing community of North Carolina since 2003, bringing you fishing reports, fishing information, fishing tournaments, fishing schools, and here in our latest and greatest effort, the Saltwater Podcast Series, where we reach out to our captain and guide friends from up and down the North Carolina coast and ask them to share with us their insight, their knowledge on how to catch more fish more often. In this endeavor, I am joined every week by my podcast partner, Billy Thorpe of Thorpe Creative. Hello, Billy. Let's make a podcast.
Yeah, let's go. I thought, you know what? I got to change this up a little bit. I got to make it a little shocker for all the people who've been listening and watching for a long time. We appreciate it. Always a good time here on the Fisherman's Post podcast, and I'm really excited for our guest tonight. He's a good time. So you guys better keep it PG, Gary. I don't want to have to edit a bunch of bleeps and stuff. You guys get too wild. Right. So anyway, we'll get this thing kicked off by shouting out our sponsors. First up, we got SRD20. So go to srd20.com. They sent us over some waterless wash and wax there. Also some graphene spray protectant for your boat. So if you are looking for some new chemicals to clean your boat with, be sure to go check out srd20.com. They make it easy, Gary. They make it easy.
I could have used, I need to get that product in hand. I pulled the boat out the other day just to sort of, even though the bottom's painted, you just have to pull it out a couple times, knock the barnacles off the bottom, some barnacles. And as I was pulling it out at the boat ramp, I was thinking, man, I wish I had that waterless, wash and wax just to hit the scum line, just to sort of hit the outside of the hull, if nothing else. I mean, it serves more purpose than that, but that would have been a perfect opportunity. Pulled off on the side of the boat ramp, no hose around, and just hit that while it's fresh, while it's wet, and not only clean it, but protect it at the same time, man. Smart thinking, smart product.
Yeah, man, I actually got a box of it over here for you and some other stuff. I'll bring it across the road so you can have it.
Come and show me how to do it. If you wouldn't mind showing me how to waterless wash and wax. If you show me a few times, I'll pick it up.
Yeah, man, that's part of my sponsorship agreement with SRD for us. Like I'll give free tutorials, like spray and wipe. Right? Is that what it is?
I'll film while you clean my boat. How about that?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect, Gary. How many times do you need that done? How many times? Multiple times a week?
As many as you're willing to do, man. As many as you'll do.
You get 3 healthy young boys. They can get out there and do it, right? They charge too much, I bet. If they're like
Kids
their dad.
Today.
If they're like their dad, they charge way. They're overpriced. Oh man. All right, and then we got Marine Warehouse Center, longtime sponsor of the show. Got a little message from them, and then we'll come back and figure out where in the world Emmett is.
At Marine Warehouse, we have everything from trailer parts, engines, engine parts, new boats, boat parts, a full store. We have a service department. We are your one-stop shop for marine equipment and hardware.
We offer a wide variety of parts and accessories for all your marine needs. The best part about working at Marine Warehouse Center is to help customers really get the most out of their coastal lifestyle and share our love for the water.
At Marine Warehouse, we're here to get you out on the water because of our love for the water. We like being out there, and we want you out there with us.
Boom, there you go. There they are. Again.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I've been talking about different things and, taking care of the trailer. I mentioned that in a future podcast, I guess, but taking care of the trailer is important, everyone. Like as you head into the winter months, many of you pull your boat out of the water or store it. Why not get that trailer tuned up as well? For me, I always get it tuned up prior to any kind of, hurricane season. And certainly with the recent weather events, as I talk about in another podcast, man, it just makes sense to have a trailer ready to go in case you need to pull, in case the category builds, in case the cone of uncertainty, locks more in on us, all that stuff, man. You want to have a trailer.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I don't know anything about needing a trailer for a boat. I need a boat. So if you're like me and you need a boat, go buy a boat from those guys as well. And you'll probably see Emmett there But he's been making his rounds. Not only will you see him doing some local TV spots like the one we just played, but Gary, he's been making some guest appearances on some really big TV shows here lately. And I'm going to give you the opportunity to guess which TV show that is. It happens after your bedtime, and it's one of the biggest shows on NBC.
Oh, I don't know my networks, but if it happens after I go to bed, I mean, I'm just going to guess it's a late night talk show. I mean, I'm going to guess that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's okay. So you want to take a guess at the host of which one?
I don't know that I know any names of the hosts.
You're not going to appeal to our younger crowd. You're not going to appeal to our younger crowd. Jimmy Fallon, ladies and gentlemen. There's Emmett on the Jimmy Fallon Show. I like Jimmy Fallon a lot. Look at him. And that
I like Jimmy Fallon too.
And that may, Gary, or may not be the body of Donald Trump. I'm not going to disclose that information, but
I was going to say that red, white, and blue is looking pretty political to me. Pretty political.
Yeah, what gave it away, like the American flag pin?
Well, good for Emmett, man. I'm glad he's getting on some late night talk shows. I'm sure it's not as good as the exposure we're giving him, but I bet Fallon helps a little bit.
Yeah, Fallon, just a little bit. Oh, James over there. James does a good job, but nothing like the Fisherman's Post podcast. And if you want to be a sponsor of the Fisherman's Post podcast and get as much exposure, probably not as much as Emmett because he just keeps us on our toes. And he makes us do these spots, actually. We didn't come up with this. He came up with it and made us do it. Part of the sponsorship. Give us a call. Also, I will show you a fish picture real quick, and then we'll talk about some fishing other stuff. Okay, here we go. Curtis Pelt from Rocky Mount, North Carolina with 2 speckled trout, 21 inches, caught in the Noosa River on a Yozuri twitch bait. Gary, what do you think? Over or under 21, or do you think it's on the money? What's your guess?
I'm gonna give him.
Is that 21 total? Both 21. Fish.
Right. Man, you can manipulate photos to make the fish look a lot bigger, and if you don't manipulate the photo, then they don't look bigger. They might look. I'm gonna give them the shadow of the doubt.
You see a lot. You see thousands of photos with Fisherman's Post. We need to do we need to do a photo show of how to properly do it. We'll do a segment or something of how to properly take a fish photo for the Fisherman's Post to greater your odds of being a part of the publication. That'd be a good segment, Gary. I think people need to know.
We can do that. I have some thoughts.
Just hold it here.
I have some thoughts.
All right, man. And weekly fishing reports. I'll pass it over to you.
Well, yeah. With this podcast coming out in October, we're actually getting ready to wrap up our weekly session of the year. These weekly fishing reports, as advertised, are from April through October, but we still certainly keep busy year round. And so we pull back to bi-weekly fishing reports, but we're also going to include some live show appearances. We're going to have some of our captains on answering questions in real time. You text in your questions, you call in your questions, email in your questions. So if you've wished that you could be sitting in this chair and ask better questions than I do, then our members, got to be a member, still got to be signed up for the weekly report, are going to be enjoying live shows throughout the winter. And then, our bread and butter, though, is April through October, weekly fishing reports, 11 of the top guides from up and down the North Carolina coast. More information at fishermanspost.com. Click on member content.
Boom. Man, you do such a good job, Gary, especially when I just throw that at you unexpectedly. And I'm excited because Luke is actually a part of that. Shows up diligently every week and gives us a great report. So I know this podcast can be awesome. I'm excited for you guys to get started.
It's going to be awesome. Luke's going to be, I want to overpromise. I want to build up expectations for Luke Moser because he's going to deliver perhaps the best podcast we've ever done.
We might even just be done with the show. We might even just be like, this is it. This is the finale.
Pinnacle. We've pinnacled. This is it.
We can't even do anymore because he's
the podcast is now owned by Luke. Luke Moser now owns the podcast. He'll be taking over the reins.
He's now the commissioner. All right.
Well, it is my pleasure, yes, to welcome to the show longtime friend, longtime contributor in so many ways. I'm talking about Captain Luke Moser, Coastline Charters, and I didn't even check with him. I just said operating out of the Wrightsville and the Carolina Beach area. Is that an accurate description, Luke? Is that how you self-describe, out of Wrightsville and Carolina Beach?
Yeah, definitely, man. I would say so. I'm kind of right smack dab in the middle of both of them. So I would say that's plenty sufficient.
All right. Artificials, and that's why we had Carolina Beach and Wrightsville Beach, speckled trout. And people love to hear about speckled trout. I'm interested in talking about speckled trout, especially because I think trout get some love to the south of us, Carolina Beach, Wrightsville Beach, and trout get plenty of love to the north of us, Swansboro, Sneeds Ferry, but not so much here, even Topsail, so not so much here. So I'm looking forward to bringing our local trout into the limelight. But even with that want, we still have a process, and the process is 2 questions. You tell me you're ready for question number 1. I'll give you question number 1.
Let's do it.
Question number 1, Captain Luke Moser, and it's very predictable. Why should we listen to anything you have to say about a speckled trout, Carolina Beach, Wrightsville Beach boy?
Well, to be honest with you, Gary, I thought we were talking about, brim fishing with, brim busters and rooster tails. So I don't know that I would listen to me. I had my fly gear tied up, to go fish lily pads, but, no, man, I don't know that I possess any sort of, crazy trout knowledge, other than just the time on the water. Growing up, me and my dad didn't do a ton of trout fishing. Most of ours was geared towards, flounder and sheep's head. So certainly over the years of the flounder fishery changing the way it's been, man, I've really, picked up I would say probably a borderline obsession with it. That's it, man. Just spending the time on the water, man. I've had some, really good success over the years trout fishing, and not really branching too far out other than, Wrightsville, Carolina, and down in the Cape Fear River. So that would be it, man. I would just say just from, the experience I have, and, the productivity that I have out of this area, I certainly feel like I can help, contribute that information to people who are struggling, because it can be, somewhat tricky to fish. It's not quite the same as, fishing up in the New River or Swansboro or somewhere like that, where these guys have these, big estuaries that are just, chock full of big trout. You do have to search a little bit more here. And I, feel like I've put the time in to kind of get that dialed in a little bit.
All right. Definitely a passable answer to question number 1. Question number 2, as you know, returning guest to the podcast is a non-fishing related question. Are you ready for your non-fishing related question?
I think so.
All right. Artificials are fake baits. Fake baits. Your questions have to do with fake boobs, or I'm going to ask you about fake boobs. All right. Question number 1. Do fake boobs sink or float?
Hey, honey. Well, Gary, I don't know. I would assume they would float, but I don't know.
Well, the internet tells me, and the internet knows all, that saline and silicone filling has a density similar to water, so they neither sink nor float, which is why it's kind of a trick question. So I have question number 2 for you. What state has the most boob jobs per capita?
Which state? How many can I pick? Surely I get to have
2.
A couple of guesses. 2?
2.
Oh, man. Let's go with California and, I don't know, Vegas.
Well,
that's not.
I would say I like your choices, but apparently Utah. I mean, and I don't know about again, per capita, so maybe not total number, but per capita, more women in Utah than percentage-wise than women in Vegas or California. And then finally, what is the most common size breast implant?
Are we frozen? Let's go with a D.
Pervert, it's a C cup. All right, let's talk trout. Let's talk artificials for trout in the Carolina Beach and Wrightsville Beach area. Very intuitive. We're going to talk about habitats. So let's talk about where people should start to look for these fall trout in the Wrightsville Beach and Carolina Beach area.
Sure. Man, it's not all that different from Reds, the typically, when I go out, especially, certainly this time of year, it can be, a little bit finicky. They're kind of getting in the fall pattern. You still have some southerly wind that, kind of keeps the fish in limbo land, but it's not all that much different from, fishing for redfish, except for maybe the water depth. I've certainly catch trout, in all depths of water, but, going into the fall, at least around Wrightsville Beach, I'm fishing, a lot of like 3 to 8 foot, I would say on average. And a lot of the places I'm looking for, creeks along the ICW, they're not all this way, but a lot of them have, what I would consider a trough where, if you go in on one side of the creek or the other, if you hug the grass bank and just off of it, a lot of times there's a deeper cut in these creeks. And those are typically, the places that I try to look for. They somewhat channel bait through those areas because, typically towards the middle part of the creek, it's going to be significantly shallower, and up close to the grass is going to be deep. So it somewhat makes a funnel, for the bait, to come through. So, I'm trying to ride around and look for these areas, if I can have that, that's not to say that's the gospel. But that's a very key factor in locating trout, at least for me in this area. The second thing I'm going to be looking for is, the topography of the bank itself, if you will. I like banks that have a lot of points, pockets, a lot of grass points, at least in Wrightsville Beach and Carolina Beach, I associate with oysters, which is certainly, like I said, very similar to drum. Those are places where you're going to find those reds mix, which is also, where you're going to have a pretty big congregation of trout, as it moves into the fall. You've got that deep cut, so it's already an ambush point, if you will, and then you've got those points, those oyster bars, where those shrimp and other bait fish are going to congregate on, and that's where those trout are going to be laying around. So those are the quickest, easiest places to me that I like to look for. And now that's certainly not something you can just see riding down the waterway. You can certainly see the points and pockets, but to actually go in the creek and find these troughs, is something you actually have to go in there and do it. Now, again, that's not the gospel, but typically any kind of grass bank, even if it doesn't have those troughs on them, I still want some kind of change, on the grass line, whether it be a ledge or oysters, any kind of points. I like to look for some kind of structure there. Even though it's not maybe visibly to your eye other than just the point, but some kind of vegetation change, whatever it may be, is typically what I'm looking for. And I guess to come off of that, coming back to fishing just the creeks along the ICW, you don't even have to be. I think there's a lot of people that have this misconception that you have to be in the mouth of the creek. Everybody does preach creek mouth, creek mouth, creek mouth. When you first come into these places, you may not have any of that, any of the, the points or the troughs or whatever, but if you keep pushing on back up the creek, a lot of times that's where you're going to find a lot of fish. It's not so much just directly in the mouth of the creek. If you go up and down the waterway in the fall of the year, everybody's sitting in the mouth. Well, you never see anybody push back up in there. And, that's certainly, especially as your tide comes in, man, that's where your bait, your shrimp, any of that stuff is going to go. So that's one thing I like to try to, encourage people is don't just stop at the creek mouth and fish it for 10 minutes and say, well, there's nothing here. Even on the fallen, the tide falling out of the creek, people still like to fish the fallen part, right at the mouth, Well, I would certainly do that on a, lower water, but, if you keep on pushing back, man, you're just going to continue to follow that bait. So I just like to try to do a little bit of that, both, not just fishing directly in the creek mouths, if any of that makes sense.
No, man, I follow all that. I think it all made sense. And so just to be clear for our listeners, viewers, like it's not that you don't fish the river, but most of your trout efforts are ICW or creeks, creek mouths, creeks off the ICW, in between that Carolina Beach and Wrightsville Beach area, or to the north of Wrightsville
Definitely.
Beach and beyond. And
Yeah.
I think that was part of what engaged me about this podcast, is focusing on that area instead of, say, something like the river or some of the more traditional trout habitats.
Definitely. Yeah. I would say 98% of my trout fishery is, around Wrightsville and Carolina. I'll go in the river some just as something extra to do. But most of it's just fully right there directly in the waterway, in this area. Um, and I guess we can kind of roll in to, that's kind of the basic thing as far as, the first start of fall. Now as you get later into the year, man, I'll start to look at some of the structures. There will be trout that'll get on these deeper ledges, that are associated with docks. And again, that's more towards the cooler months. But that's another thing to look for. It doesn't have to be, in a creek or back in the bays. These fish will feed directly along, the waterway where you don't, typically see people trout fishing. And it's kind of the same thing. I'm looking for some sort of, topography change, whether it's, a ledge that falls straight off the bank, a shelly bottom. And again, some of the docks have this very similar setup. A lot of these docks have lights on them. If you can find the ones that have, deep water out on front on those ledges with those lights, it creates a great ambush point, for those trouts. I mean, that's always something I like to look for, especially as you start going into the cooler months. But, that's the most generic stuff. Just getting into it to look for, man. You can make it as complicated as you want, but, you start fishing those type of areas, some of the baits and techniques we'll get into, man, you're going to produce fish.
All right. So as far as transition from habitat more to conditions, so, this podcast will be released mid-October, and, we start talking about falling into the fall pattern. Every year is different, of course, but in general terms, when do you start getting more confident that, say, on a charter, not just Luke Moser going out and looking for fish, but the fish are there enough to where you have reasonable confidence you can take a group of anglers of different ability out and actually put some trout in the boat? When are conditions right around here, Carolina Beach, Wrightsville Beach?
Okay. That's actually a good question. Certainly, starting into September, early October, you kind of get in that iffy stage where, I don't know that I would fully commit to taking, a full charter there unless it was somebody I knew that could fish. It is a little bit early. We've had some great days already, but usually about the middle part of October, man, it's jamming. It's certainly, changes with every year, and a lot of that's based on how much, north wind we get to cool this water down and actually, get a good push of migratory fish. But even if you don't, if the wind comes later and it's not quite cooled off, even still around that middle point of October, you're going to get your residential fish that have, been here all throughout the summer that just aren't feeding. Those fish are going to become active. So even if you don't have, what I would consider like jam up trout fishing with your, high migratory fish, you're still going to have the residential fish that start to pick up. And that's all around, like I said, mid-October. Even taken out, every year's different. It's still cool enough at some point to get some of those residential fish fired up. But definitely, man, as far as being on and having all the faith in the world to take somebody out, and feel confident about catching fish, I'd say right in the middle of October, and well on through, up until December, is definitely the best time, I think. If that answers your question.
Yeah. And so I know that anglers will spend a lifetime trying to understand a trout, and get closer and closer, but never get there. And as you're talking, it just made me realize again, like just trying to understand trout. So in the conversation we just had, so there's resident trout in this area year round, but those resident trout will get more active as the water gets colder. And then I think you said we also have migratory trout coming through, because that's what I was trying to understand. So is that it? It's like the water is colder, so the resident trout are less sluggish, or what is it about the colder water that turns the resident trout on? And as far as migrating trout, is that north to south, or are they just on the move?
Yeah. So it's definitely north to south. you know, but yes, we do have resident trout that, you know, will stay here throughout the year, especially through the whole summer. You know, and I certainly think they're, you know, a little bit sluggish. You know, you do hear guys going out into, you know, throw topwater and stuff for them at night. And that's a whole nother deal on its own. But, yes, they're certainly still here. They're just not nearly as active. They get really sluggish in the summer. You know, a lot of them I associate with being, you know, male trout or big females that, you know, are just sluggish with the heat. So yes, you know, when you start getting those cool fronts, you know, those fish are going to become active. You know, and last year we had at least for me, you know, it wasn't the most jam up trout year I've ever had. And just to, you know, put it into a perspective for you talking about migrating fish, you know, that is certainly something that plays a role in it. I've got some friends that are up in the Chesapeake Bay, and, you know, we typically go up there every year for vacation. And I was talking to those guys just to see how their fishery was. And this was well into October, really in November, when typically their fishery has slowed down, you know, a substantial amount as far as the trout goes, you know, because those fish are making a push, you know, leaving the bay and coming down south. And, you know, they stay catching fish way later than normal just because, you know, the water temperature was so high. And I think there's some other people that could, you know, agree they didn't have the best, you know, the best trout year just because we didn't get that push of fish. They stayed up north longer. So that to me is what really drives, you know, the trout fishery is the fall wind and water temperature change.
All right. So to continue the conversation about conditions, and yeah, man, I certainly understood the habitat conversation fully. You know, grass lines, deeper water, deeper, you know, lines with points, with pockets, grass lines with, you know, oysters, you know, creating rips, points creating rips, and not just sticking near the mouth, but moving farther up the creek and find other areas, not just where the creek will empty into the ICW. And so talk to me, I guess, first about tide, about how tide might affect, you know, how you where you fish or how, I mean, I'm not sure how to set you up on that, but I know you were going to
Yeah, no,
talk about how
that's
conditions affect your plan.
definitely. You somewhat just touched on it just then, Gary. You know, talking about rips. You know, to me, I associate the huge portion of trout fishing with moving water. So tide plays a tremendous role in it, especially, you know, in trout season. You know, winter trout fishing is a hair different. You know, and I'm not necessarily going to harp on that, but 100%, man. If I don't have, you know, typically if there's not moving water, I'm not catching fish. So, you know, the ideal setup to me, you know, in the morning would be, you know, certainly where, you know, you get out there at sun up and you've got, you know, let's say high tide at 9 o'clock, you know, that gives you plenty of time to fish the clean water coming in, and then plenty of time to fish, you know, the falling tide going out, you know, in other words, so you've got good water all day. Um, Obviously that doesn't work out every weekend or every day for, you know, the people who don't get to get out often. You know, so I haven't found that, you know, one tide is better than the other. You know, I don't associate trout with water clarity. At least for me, I don't have any issues with them biting in muddy water. So, you know, to me, the main thing is just the moving water. Now, certainly at the top of the tide and the bottom of the tide is going to be slower. And, you know, the transition period to turn around, you know, you certainly have a lag. Um, you know, so to me, the worst tide to fish is, you know, right at high. And this is just me, you know, somebody else may hear this, well, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And that's fine. This is just from my experience. The top of the tide is pretty poor. And then even sometimes, man, it takes an hour, 2 hours into the tide changing to get the water flowing, you know, to the right amount to get the fish to feed. But, you know, with that being said, it doesn't matter high tide, low tide. You know, when I'm fishing these areas, you know, I'm looking for, you know, for that quicker moving water along those grass lines, man. When you get those rips that, you know, that come through those points, those little transition areas from points to pockets, you know, that's typically where those fish are going to be. And I always like to throw, you know, on the upstream side of it. And I'll get into that with some of the lures, but, you know, that, and then letting it come down through the current, you know, that's the main thing is, and again, I'll kind of harp on this when we get into some of the lures and tactics, but, you know, using the tide to your advantage, to actually let your bait work. So that's the main thing I'm looking for. Again, it's not so much high tide, low tide as it is just good flowing water.
Another question about conditions, and yes, I followed all that. Another question about conditions. So, is it romantic to think that snotty, nasty weather equates to good trout fishing, or is that legit?
I will put my boat in the rain to go trout fish, 100%. It's like anything, man. The fish cannot bite, but some of my best days trout fishing have been on, I'm not wind. I don't necessarily love to trout fish, in heavy wind. Not that they won't bite, but you're typically throwing light lures, so it can be a little bit tough. But the rainier and gray, cold, whatever, man, that's by far some of the best fishing I've ever had. Trout fishing. So I will, even on charters, if the weather's poor and they're like, yeah, I don't know, man, I'm always like, please, let's go. You're going to have an increasingly better chance, and you have, another opportunity that, we'll get into, you can use different tactics that you wouldn't normally be able to do, midday on a sunny day. You can keep throwing, top water all day long when it's cloudy and have, great success. So definitely, man, I love fishing in poor weather for sure.
Well, I knew that a conversation about tide would lead itself to, technique and, how a tide might affect it. Mm-hmm. And so we'll ride that into sort of the next part. And we have tackles, so we have lures. I mean, I'm sure you're going to tell me about tying them on and all that. But let's you take it over, man. Let's talk about what you like to tie on the end, and we can isolate that and then talk about techniques, or you can talk about a couple of types of lures and their technique, and then talk about a couple more lures and techniques. I'll let you sort of guide how this podcast goes.
Yeah, definitely, man. One thing I've gotten to where I enjoy quite a bit, and especially as a way of locating fish. If I haven't, if I'm getting tired of what I'm doing, or the fish I've been fishing are kind of slowed up, or somebody came in there with a gill net or something, whatever. And this is a great tool for somebody just trying to figure trout out, or at least just locate them, because you can spend a lot of time, trying to locate fish. And if you're throwing, something they don't want, they're just not gonna, they're not gonna bite for you. So, and again, this can certainly happen with this, but I've gotten to where I really enjoy trolling for trout, man. It's something I used to do a long time ago, and I've kind of gotten back into it. I'll troll a variety of different, baits, but the main one that stands out, tried and true to me, is the MR51's. It's the stupidest look to me, is the dumbest looking bait. It has no good presentation really, but for whatever reason, man, trolling them, and it doesn't necessarily matter what color. I mean, I kind of stay with the standard mirror lure color, just that kind of goldish red. But trolling those lures around, grass banks or, ledges, drop offs, anything like that is a fantastic way to locate fish, man. I've spent a lot of time, like I said, trolling different lures, but that one, for whatever reason, just works. And it doesn't have, like I said, it has very little action in the water. It doesn't look like it would catch fish to me, but it does. So that's something that I would, stress to people is a great way to do that. Now, typically what I'll, do is I'll get in there and I'm trolling as slow as I can possibly go. A lot of times maybe just going with the tide, maybe a hair more, usually around a mile and a half, if I can get it to go that slow, just to keep the bait up. And again, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, man. I'll throw out 2 rods and just cruise down the grass bank. And it's really, really done well. And it's helped me to be able to locate a lot of fish that, was an area I might not typically go to. You can pull up to a bank and fish it for 5 minutes. So, well, there's no fish here, because you don't have the confidence in it. I'm guilty of that. If I don't go and catch fish right away, I'm like, well, there's no fish here. Well, you can spend, 5-10 minutes trolling those mirror lures back and forth and cover the whole entire bank. And, you can leave from there saying that, well, they weren't here, or, they're everywhere. So that's the one thing that I really like to do, man. That's just the first lure I was going to talk about. And I don't know how many people have taken the time to troll, man, but I would highly recommend it. I can't harp on it enough as far as just locating fish.
All right, I'm intrigued. I didn't know we were going to talk about trolling for trout. I'm glad we did. So MR51, and you're saying go as slow as you can go, and that again is with the tide. So you're never trolling against current. You try to go with the current, or you'll go back and forth and try both directions.
Absolutely. I'll go back and forth. Typically going with the tide, you have to speed up a little bit just because it'll end up, catching the back of your boat and pushing you kind of funky. But really, I want to keep it around, under 2 miles an hour for sure. I've found that I typically catch or get more bites going with the tide. But I'm certainly not going to, go down and then turn around and come all the way back up. In this area, we don't have necessarily all the grass lines to do that versus like if you get down into the Cape Fear River or somewhere else where you have, these long runs of, creeks and grass. So I'll just, I'll go down, run the stretch of bank I want to, and then, turn around and go back, sometimes I'll do that 2 or 3 times, man. And it doesn't take that long. You can leave that area and say, well, shoot, man, I've fished this hard, and you can easily leave and go somewhere else. If you haven't done so, but you're never going to, to me, if I pull into a spot I'm not sure about, very rarely do I fish the whole thing or give it a solid effort, like I would trolling. At least I've covered, the whole basis going through it.
All right. Another question, and then I think we'll move on. And that would be, and you're talking about trolling with the big engine, not with the trolling motor.
You can do both. It doesn't matter. They don't bother it. I don't, you don't have to heave it out, 700 miles behind you. I'll put one out, say 25 yards and the other one out, 30 yards or 35 yards. They don't, if you have a trolling motor, yeah, you can definitely do that. I do both, but it doesn't bother the fish at all. Not that I've seen, and if you are, wondering if maybe you're not getting bites, you're getting some short strikes or something, you can let out a little bit more line, but it doesn't matter. Not that I've seen. And that,
Right.
and that's, I was going to come back to this, the trolling those mirrors, you got kind of a pretty wide range of depth. You can typically troll those, really in 2 foot of water or more. If you get into something deeper than, 8 or 10 feet, you're going to have to slow your speed down a little bit. But, you hit that 2 foot mark, you don't necessarily have to feel, like you're done. You can reel your line up a little bit to get it up a little bit higher in the water column. But, anywhere from 2 foot to 10 foot or more, man, is fair game.
All right. As far as lures go, do we go to soft plastics or hard baits first?
Yeah, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna get right into topwater, man. I think, everybody likes to see a topwater blow up, including myself. And again, the topwater kind of falls into a little bit of, sort of like trolling in a way to me, man. You can cover a lot of ground with it, pretty quick. Typically topwater baits, you can do some real long knockdown casts with it and cover a lot of ground. So, that's always my go-to, man. First thing in the morning, I'm going to put a topwater plug on for sure. I mean, I don't even mess with anything else, especially when the trout are chewing good. I think the topwater typically produces a better quality of fish, in my opinion. I've caught trout on all sizes, but I do think I've had more consistent big trout on topwater than anything. So, it's just preference, but, any kind of walking bait, I think people put a lot of hype into, what color it is and everything. You buy a topwater plug and the top of it's pink and, it's got googly eyes on it and everything. Well, they don't see that. They see the bottom of it. Right. So, I'm typically fishing something that's got a white belly. I don't care what the top, the color of it is. I've certainly thrown some that are orange and red, but, I'm looking for white. Even if the color's poor, that's kind of a go-to. But again, it's just preference. But, don't get fooled by the, pink double orange banana, Zara spook. The fish don't see that. They just see the bottom of it. So, but topwater to me, man, is a fantastic search bait. And I'm really concentrating, on those areas of, rip, throwing at those points, bringing it past the points, and especially on those little ledges and troughs, you don't always, I'm not always throwing directly to the bank and bringing it back. A lot of it, and we'll get into this with the rest of the lures, man, is letting the current work for you. Let your bait, swing out through the current, even topwater, man. And, just walking it down the line, throw it to the bank and let it sweep all the way through and come out through that trough. And then what you do there, you've covered the whole bank line. You've covered that, the deeper section of it. And then if it comes out straight, you're starting to get on that ledge, or maybe it picks back up. You got all those little transition zones where you're not sure. The fish aren't always feeding right up against the bank. So a lot of times they'll be out there in that deep cut or right on the edge of that, opposite sandbar. So, that to me is a very, very key factor in throwing topwater or any lure. Is just letting it sweep through that current. Don't kill yourself making all these casts, man. I spend a lot of time letting the tide work for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, man, that does make sense. And like everything about the topwater. So, I mean, I might come back with some topwater questions, but just with one eye on the clock, I want to keep on moving through and at least cover everything a little bit. What's next, man? What do you want to talk about next?
Yeah, man, the soft plastics. There's a gajillion of them. You can get very overwhelmed in any of it. For me, obviously everybody loves DOA. DOAs are great. Any color is fantastic. The voodoo shrimp are great as well. They sting a little bit harder when a bluefish cuts them in half, just because they're kind of expensive. A lot of the Z-Man stuff, the trout tricks, man, are fantastic. That's as far as soft plastics, man. That's a lot of my game right there. I throw a lot of shrimp imitation baits, and I think one thing that I've found that's really helped me out with any of the soft plastics is, I think a lot of people get tied into wanting to feel the bottom, when they're throwing soft plastics. What I've started to do is, when you buy the boot, if you buy DOAs or any of that, they don't have a very big weight in them. So I'm typically trying to keep something that's not, I don't want to hit the bottom, not in trout season. Those fish are going to be feeding in the middle of the water column or up on top. So I'm looking for any kind of, shrimp imitation or, some of the paddle tails, things like that, man, that are light. I'm going to fish them on as light a weight as I can to get them down, into that water column. But I want them to be light enough, man, where you'll certainly be able to tell, again, as you fish these baits and you're swinging through the current, you want your bait to stay with the tide and move through that column, as it just drifts and flutters through, just letting the tide, do the work for you. There's a bunch of different ways to fish that stuff, but, letting a DOA just sweep through, around the grass lines and the oysters, man, it's incredibly hard to beat. It is very, very productive. And I'm trying to see how I'm assuming that makes sense. So what I'm talking about, where I'm actually trying to get these things to go with the current, man, you don't have to put hardly any action on it at all. I'm just holding my rod tip up and letting it flow, and you just pop it every once in a while. If that makes sense, Gary.
Yeah, man, that makes sense. And so now that we're not talking about trolling, we're talking about working a soft plastic. Are you ever drifting and fishing soft plastics, or are you always sort of anchored up and then targeting a zone, again, letting the tide work that bait down the grass line?
A little bit of both, Gary. If it's a slower day, I'll typically get on my trolling motor, and if it's an area I know has got fish in it, I'll get on my trolling motor and actually work through it. Now at that point, I'm not so much letting the tide do the work for me. I'm fishing it, going with the tide. But I would say 90% of it is, I'll anchor up or spot lock, whatever, and fish an area for 15, 20 minutes. And if I haven't got this fish going or anything, then I may pop down to the next spot and try it for a few minutes. But again, being able to use the tide to do the work for you, man, I'll as soon as it comes through, you can flip your bail, and pop off a foot or two of line and keep letting it go. So I can typically cover a lot of ground in one spot. But most of it, I would say, is probably anchored, really.
Okay. And then I followed your conversation about top waters and, really focus on the bottom of the bait, not worried about color. Do you worry
Mhm.
about color much with soft plastic?
Yeah, that's what I was getting ready to say. Yes, and it is certainly a trial and error. I've got my handful of soft plastics that I like to use. Like I just talked about, um, and I've got a few more that I kind of keep for a rainy day just to see. But definitely, if I can't get them fired up on one thing, say I went in the day before and I whacked them and I know these fish are there, then I might start switching colors, and I've certainly seen it. Where you sit there for 30 minutes, kind of waiting on the tide to get right or whatever, and you think you're going to get a bite, and they never turn on, and you change color, whether it be your lead jig head or just a shade, and say you got pink and you put white on, absolutely that makes a difference. Now I don't. It's very easy to get caught in the moment of, well, I didn't get a bite, I got to change colors right now, and sometimes that works, sometimes that certainly works to go through a bunch of colors, but you got to have confidence in what you got. You got to be throwing something in, and if you don't have, and if that makes sense, and I try to tell customers is if you don't have confidence in what you're doing, and the way you're working it, you're not gonna catch fish, and especially trout because they can be finicky. If you're not working it right, you're switching through a bunch of colors because you think the fish aren't biting. That can certainly mess you up. But I like to give it a good solid effort with what I've got before I start changing colors for sure.
All right.
And
Um, I was going to swing back around, and we hear it a lot, like you'll kind of want to throw the lightest you can throw. And I certainly understand you don't want to hit bottom. But again, I think of the novice angler trying to figure out what's the quote unquote lightest I can throw. I mean, what's the goal? You don't want that bait to go past mid water column. And as long as you're not hitting bottom, it's the right size jig head. Or if you're not hitting bottom, do you still have to consider going to a lighter jig head?
yeah, Gary, a lot of it's just it's hard to explain. A lot of it's just spending the time out there to figure out what you need. And there's nothing wrong with I shouldn't say hit the bottom. I don't like to hit the bottom that time of year, just because I feel like I end up getting the bait below where those fish are actually feeding. But there's a lot of times again where you can learn to use the current in your favor. Even if you've got a heavy weight on, or maybe a hair too heavy, if you keep your rod tip up high and your line tight, it's going to keep your bait up. And if you're doing that and you're still hitting the bottom, then, or getting hung up or whatever, then that may be when I would downsize a little bit. But a lot of it, I let the tide dictate what it's doing. To me, again, once you start getting into the the high part of the tide or the low part of the tide, your water is going to slow down quite dramatically. So you're going to be able to tell that, okay, my weight's too heavy now, which is also a lot of times when the fishing's not that good anyways. But I would more so change it based on maybe not getting bites. If you're letting your bait sink a little bit harder, with it flowing through the tide, you're not keeping your rod up, or you're not twitching it every once in a while. You start finding that you're getting bites closer to the bottom. And then I would switch on that. And I've certainly been able to do that. Where I think the fish just aren't biting, and you let it sink a little bit better. Not so much relying on the tide, and that's when you produce fish. But you should be able to tell based on the bites you're getting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, man, that makes sense. And then again, for time constraints, I just want to make sure we've touched on anything. Not talking about top waters, but talking about other hard baits, subsurface baits, etc.
Yep.
Is that part of your gamut? Is there a
Oh
time you
yeah.
like to throw
Oh yeah.
those?
Definitely. I would say I throw more hard baits this time of year, solely because there's a lot more bait around. Man, any kind of jerk baits, in a variety of different colors. White's always tried and true. There's quite a few different, hard bait shrimp lures out there. It's still a type of jerk bait. I think a lot of that is you get that reaction bite, because those fish are still feeding on, glass minnows and finger mullets and stuff like that. So any kind of suspended jerk bait is fantastic. So same deal with the MR17s, man. I mean, everybody knows the MR17s are, they've been around for years. A lot of people fish them. Those are great baits as well. And that's, again, I don't fish those baits that much differently. I think the jerk baits and the hard baits fall very much into the top water. You can cover a lot of ground with them. They've got enough weight and enough action where you can fish those through the tide. You don't necessarily have to let the tide work them. They're going to be at the depth you want, just based on them being, a suspending bait, and you're putting the action on it. So fantastic way to cover ground, just to search and look for fish. If you're not feeling the trolling or whatever. But those two style baits are, I would say pretty much the only kind of hard baits I use outside of top water. And again, with some of the mirror lures and stuff, I will keep several different colors of those in. But typically, white has always held true for me, white or pink.
Okay. So and maybe you alluded to this in the very beginning of your talk about hard baits, but when would, in your mind, a hard bait be a superior option than a soft bait? Is it, I think you said something about still lots of bait in the water. Is it like a bigger profile and it's more visible? And so is that the answer to when hard bait, when soft bait?
Yes and no, Gary. I mean, some of it, I would say a lot of it's got more so to do just, the first part of, trout season, you've got an astronomical amount of glass minnows in the water and still finger mullet in the water. And, again, a lot of your residential trout, at least in this area, they're still feeding on that. And, if you're out early in the morning, you should see that response, based on fish blowing up on top water. I don't care where it is, redfish, whatever, they're all doing the same thing. So I think that's why it's more closely imitated to, what they're actually feeding on. There's certainly still shrimp around, but and there will be to continue through that. Now, it's not to say you can't fish, shrimp, because I'm doing both, but I think the easiest meal for those fish is, some sort of, minnow, whether it's finger mullet or menhaden or glass minnows. You got all these pushes of bait coming out of these creeks, getting into fall, moving out into the ocean, and all those baits are coming through, the transition areas, your creek mouths, your inlets, all that stuff. So, I mean, that's what those fish are feeding on, because it's coming right to them. So I think that's part of the reason why I think those baits produce so well this time of year. And they're as active as they're going to be. You don't have to fish something slow and let it go through the current if you don't want to. They'll flat out chase a jerk bait or a mirror lure down. I catch a lot of fish, reeling my bait in to go recast. So that's why I like to throw it, man. They're just active and really keyed in on bait that time of year, I feel like.
Right on. I think we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to finish with this question. For people who have been watching this and, have certainly, been able to grasp a lot of knowledge. You've been very given of information and opinion and perspective. So the podcast is a good teaching tool, but not as good as getting on the boat with you. So if this podcast is released in mid-October and someone's watching this and thinking, man, I'm learning a lot from a podcast, I would say you could learn even more by being on the boat with Captain Luke Moser. For Wrightsville Beach and Carolina Beach area, if the good trout fishing starts around mid-October, how long does the good trout fishing last? And then is there a spring window that you also like to do? And if so, what's the basic parameters of that spring window?
Yeah, definitely, man. I mean, it does vary year to year, just like anything else. But I would say you can solidly expect trout to be biting active enough, and still in a pretty easy, predictable pattern, up until early December. Now, it's certainly a water temperature thing. I've seen it go, much longer. So really, early mid-December is a safe bet. Now, spring trout fishing, absolutely. You get a great, it doesn't last as long by any means. But the spring trout fishery to me is, in a way, I don't get the same fang fever, I guess, if you will, as I do in the fall. But your fish are typically, bigger. You usually have big females that are full of roe. So I've caught more fish over 5 pounds in the spring than I ever have in the fall. So that's one thing to get excited about to me, and it's not any different. Still fishing a lot of the same areas. I would say, a lot of it's more. It is significantly better closer to the inlets. You may not get, the push of fall fish like way back behind Mason Bro Island like you would, historically in the fall. So it's a hair different, but it's very, very similar. And all the baits, fish, and everything exactly the same.
Right on. Captain Luke Moser, Coastline Charters out of the Carolina Beach, Wrightsville Beach area. As always, enjoy talking with you, talking fish, talking whatever. And I really do appreciate you being so given of information, man. Some people are protective about trout information, and we're very open, man. We appreciate it.
Yeah, man.
Billy?
All right. What's up, Gary? You heard it here first. All the good stuff. All the good trout. All the good fall trout fishing. I told you guys it was going to be good. But that's it. This is the last episode of Fisherman's Post. Thanks, everybody, for watching and supporting us for all these years. We're out. It's a wrap.
Luke will be your host next week. And as a guest, he's interviewing himself again.
Yeah, for like the next 12 episodes. We set them side by side, do some green screen stuff. I'll still be the producer, but I won't be on the show. Some people are going to be in the chat like, hell yeah, this is going to be good.
Right?
Oh, man. A lot of good information. My takeaway is to rewind and replay. But one thing that I didn't take note of is the trolling for trout. I thought that was a pretty cool strategy to cover a lot of ground and find fish that way. So he mentioned it a couple times, and I always pay attention to couple time mentions.
Yeah, man. I don't think I've seen too much of it here in the Carolina Beach, Wrightsville Beach area. I've certainly seen it in other more, known to be trout areas. The guys trolling for it. It is effective. I've seen it more like Cape Fear River trolling for stripers. And then, I'm sure like if we had talked more about trolling, what Luke would have said is you troll to find them, and then you get off the troll and now you're casting for them. And same thing for the striper in the wintertime, troll to find them, and then you start casting to them. But I like that. I like that that's part of his gammon. I didn't know that, and I like that it is, and it actually made me think like, all right, man, I can do that. Like now I've got another window to try.
Just don't go over 2 miles an hour. I wrote that down.
I'm gonna follow everything he said. I listen.
Well, if you want to buy my notes, Gary, they're gonna be for sale.
All right.
Because I won't have any sponsors sponsor me anymore after Luke takes over the show, so I have to sell Billy's best takeaway notes to make a living around here. So anyway, man, great episode. Always enjoy Luke Moser. He is a top-notch guy and guide, so we always appreciate having him on the show and a part of our fishing reports and podcasts and everything else. So stand-up guy. Book a freaking trip with this guy and learn all his fishing trips or tips and tricks. Then go to Marine Warehouse, buy your own boat, and then keep it clean with SRD20.com. There you go.
Ooh, nice.
You like that?
You're killing it.
Killing that sponsor game. All right, Gary. Well, high five long distance, man. We'll see you in the next one.
Fisherman's